And I'm hoping people will tune in and join us and ask questions or make comments and say how great the conversation is. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, I mean, I think you got to have some really good stories and be able to answer a lot of questions about. I mean, I just think it's such an interesting, police work. I had another police officer on here. Do you know Nako Nolan? I think
yeah, I know that cat. Yes.
Yeah.
He and I, it's funny, we met on Instagram several years ago. I have met two people. One's an actor and one's in a hardcore band H2O. Both of them, when I met them, independently, separate situations, and we get to talking, and then I kind of let the cat out of the bag of like, yeah, I'm a cop. I do gang work, homicide work, but I love punk and hardcore and stuff. And both times people have been like, man, you're just like this guy I know. And they say him, and I'm like, yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. He's the West Coast version.
Yeah.
I'm the East Coast version. Like,
yeah, because you're both cops and you're both like punk rock. And I mean, yeah.
Dude, it's funny. He posted something today with a picture with Jay Leno. And my running joke is like, I'm gonna find somebody that Nako has not met. And the fool has like pictures with people. So it's not like, he's not gonna lie about it anyway. But some people would say, like, oh, he hasn't met that many people. And then boom, he's got a picture. He's got a picture with, I think it's Jocko Willnick and the lead singer, Al Barr, the lead singer of Dropkick Murphys. If I remember right, they all went to like a show together or something. And I could be mixing that up.
No, that sounds right.
But I'm like, look at this picture. Yeah, I'm like, look at this picture. You got Al in the middle of a Naco Jocko sandwich. You know what I mean? Like, it's crazy, dude. He's got good stories. If you've had him on, then you already know.
Yeah, I've had him on a few times. I like his takes on things. I like his opinions. And Andre is saying he was our hookup to
Harley. Yeah, so Harley Flanagan has a, without going too far into Cro-Mag's history, but anybody that listens to Cro-Mags knows that there was a split a long time ago. So you had John Joseph singing for Cro-Mags.
Yeah, I had him on the show. He's an interesting guy.
Who, John Joseph?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I met him at a show probably 10 years ago. Nothing but respect for me. I told him what I do. I read his book, Cro-Magnon, and I was like, man. But so anyway, Harley Flanagan still is singing with Cro-Mags, and they toured out here on the East Coast. And Andrea, my wife, hooked it up for me when I retired. Brought in my brother and buddies and linked up with Harley through Nako so that we could talk after the show with Harley. But just, I mean, stuff like that, dude. Just the ability to use Instagram and the internet for the, for positivity, like connecting that way. Yeah, that was a great retirement night, by the way. Like, just really cool. Yeah, so I can't say enough great things, obviously about my wife, but also about Nako. So that's how
he's a great guy. You're right I've heard you talk about that before, about social media being used for a positive thing. And I think people forget that because we all bash social media. And I agree, there's a lot of bad things about it, but we forget sometimes that there's a lot of good things about it. I mean, I wouldn't be able to do this podcast without the internet and social media and all that. I mean, that's how you and I met. And it's how I met through other people, through Nako, that, through my podcast, through social media. And then, and then you stay in connection with them that way. I mean, if I had to just remember people's phone numbers or whatever, like, what am I just randomly call? Hey, how you doing? How you been? Show me pictures of the last 6 months of your life, because I don't follow you on social media.
Here's a perfect example. So, Nako and I know one another. Our names are given to James Patterson and Matt Eversman. So they did a book called Walk the Blue Line. And it was a book about just police officers. So you got James Patterson, who I think is the #1 selling author, links up. He usually writes fiction. He links up with Matt Eversman, who was a retired, and I think he was a first sergeant or maybe a sergeant major. But in his earlier years as a E5, E6 staff sergeant in a Ranger regiment, he was in Somalia. So so Matt Eversman is the real life ranger who Josh Harnett, whatever, however you pronounce his name, the actor, plays in Black Hawk Down.
Oh, okay. Did you
So-
know they're making a like a real life movie about documentary about that real true story about that movie?
I didn't know that, but I know
I just
that.
saw the trailer today.
Yeah, I know that Matt and James Patterson worked on this project. They do this book, and when they did it was just 2 or 3 years ago. But there's a section in there where they interviewed Nako. There's a section in there where they interviewed me and a bunch of other officers across the country, and it's supposed to be able to show officers and what they've gone through and their perspectives through telling these stories. And Nako's, and I don't want to give it away, but Nako has one in reference to a man severing a head basically and carrying it around using his belt like through the jawbone. So I don't want to get into too much detail. It's crazy.
You don't want to give it away. I mean, what more could there be than that? Like,
it's
a big surprise right there.
Yeah, it's a crazy story. And you know, Nako's got a bunch of stories like that being in LA that way. But yeah, so either way, like the book was, I think, got a lot of really great reviews and reception. But when they were working on the project, like I said, this was a couple of years ago, so it was almost like in the height or right after the height of BLM protests and riots, and just across the country, people were just openly bashing cops and buying into that. And I think that was one of the things that James Patterson and Matt Eversman wanted to do in the book, was to show, hey, like basically people still support the police. We still want, you know, order in the cities, and here's a way they can kind of give back. And they did it like at a time when that wouldn't have been a cool thing to do. So I don't know. I think that was really cool on them. And I love that Nako and I've got sections in there. You know,
I'll have to check that out. Remind me the book again. I think I saw Nako posted about it, but
it's called Walk the Blue Line.
Walk the Blue Line. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think like one tagline, maybe on Amazon or something, maybe one of the earlier versions, was basically no right or left. You know, this isn't about politics. This is about police work. You know, so
how about just common sense? Like, I think we need police. I don't know. I know that's a crazy idea. I'm a right-wing wacko for saying that, but I think we need some police. I don't think we can just defund police departments and replace them with social workers.
The problem was that a couple of years ago, there was a trend that everyone not everyone, but a lot of people in elected positions decided we're going to listen to whatever the loudest voice. And when people are saying they want to defund the police, that's a good idea. So let's do that. Never, I don't think ever once asking police leaders, hey, is this a good idea? Do we really need to cut your funding? Because most departments, I know for me, I did, you know, my entire career in one police department in a large city in the South. And there were always budget issues. So there was no reason that budgets needed to be cut. And I think this whole theory of we're going to cut the budget and defund the police and pump money into, you know, whatever social programs or whatever else the cities had going on, you just can't do that. And the sad thing is police departments knew that and the officers knew that. But I think we were coming out of a time throughout the 1990s, 2000s, and then the 2010s where departments were just cruising along, driving violence down and really honing in on crime fighting culture. And so there was not a lot of departments pushing all these programs out about, hey, look at us, we're the police department, you know, we're going to do these ice cream functions and coffee with a cop and all this stuff. It was more like, hey, let's go after gang members, let's go after violent offenders and arrest them and move on the next day and go keep doing it. Like, we didn't need to get in front of a news camera and tell people, hey, there's crime going on and this is what we're doing. And I think what happened in the police culture is a backlash where a lot of people were able to get in front of news cameras and just say things that weren't even true about police departments. And then it was almost like departments had to play catch up, learn this whole social media culture, hire people to run social media posts and accounts for police departments to get the image out there and to be able to say, hey, like we've been doing this, good fight for decades and decades. But that was that thing, like where it was almost like trying to play catch up. And now a lot of departments sadly have pulled back their proactive assets, their drug units, their gang units, and push people back on the patrol and push people into community policing squads and things like that, and kind of left the proactive crime fighting alone. In those cities that do that, you watch their violence spike. I mean, I know what I look like. I look like when I walk into a room, if I start throwing out statistics and graphs and push my glasses up, people will listen to me. But it is true. If you got to look at graphs and you got to look at statistics, if that's what people need, you can definitely see that. There is a trend in very large cities that went away from or pulled away from doing proactive policing, and their violence spiking. That's the one thing I can tell you, that most large cities not can control violence, but can disrupt violence when it's tied into criminal organizations. Like, it's almost a no-brainer. There are very, very, very good and very capable officers and agents who know what they're doing. The worst thing departments can do is disband those units, because that knowledge and information doesn't get carried on. So the next generation coming in as police officers, they don't have these teams to work on. And I'm seeing that. I've seen it for the last probably 4 to 5 years. So that knowledge starts to go away, much like when the military is at a time of war and then they come back and the war is over, like in Vietnam. That information did not get passed down far enough for, like, by the time I got into the Army. So by the time I got into the Army, a lot of lessons that were learned in Vietnam were not necessarily being passed on to, the new soldier. The same thing, the same cycle is going on now, unfortunately, in a lot of cities in the police culture. But it's going to shift. I think you and I have talked about this in the past. That cultural shift, if you study crime and strategies, we always kind of go up and down. And as a country, we go into this lull of, well, we don't want to be, as they say, tough on crime. And when that happens, then the violence increases. So it's always this no-brainer. But for whatever reason, people think it's good policies and that sort of thing.
Well, how do you get rid of the corruption? Because I know that's an issue. I think that's what started with a lot of the BLM stuff. There are some bad cops, or there are bad policies, or there's corruption. And then you look at it on a bigger scale with the FBI or the CIA and covering things up, and there is corruption. But I agree, if you just defunded these whole organizations, you're going to miss a lot of things that they were working on, and you're starting from scratch. So I don't think but then how do you root out all this corruption? Is it kind of starting to hire younger people and train different, or just rooting out the bad eggs, or what do you do?
Police departments, for the most part, and when I say departments, I mean, I say big cities because they get the most attention, but there are suburbs oftentimes around cities, maybe not your New York, Chicago, LA, but like you pick some of these smaller cities, and those departments have been really, really good at what they do and taking care of their people. But most police departments have really good internal affairs units, and that's what they do. And when I got hired on, the Serpico era, for those people listening, if you don't know, Google Serpico. I mean, that was like the quintessential good cop who wanted to fight police corruption in New York. There was a movie made about him with Al Pacino. There's a book written about him. And so for myself, Nako, and a lot of other people entering our generation, a lot of us, that's what we were looking at. We were looking at wanting to go after violent offenders and then just destroying any kind of police corruption. So even when I joined the police department that I joined and then eventually retired from is the city I grew up in. It's the same department I ran from when I was a kid, skateboarding and stuff like that. Like, so the way I looked at it, I was like, I knew the city, but that thing of like, I get on the department, there's no way I'm going to tolerate police corruption. Like, I've been trained, so to speak, listening to punk and going to shows, like in my own experiences, like there's no way I would tolerate it. And the really cool thing about doing an entire career and never really encountering police corruption in my department, like people might break up or do a policy violation, not break the law, but like a policy violation, get written up. They may get a couple of days off for doing something stupid. And then a lot of times those same people resign and they go on and go do other jobs, not police work, because they realize they're not good at it. And it wasn't until right around the time that I retired that there was an actual police officer in my former department that was trafficking cocaine in uniform in a patrol car on duty. And that was absolutely mind-blowing for me in my area, my experience, to think that anybody that was in the department that I worked in would ever do anything like that. And you're talking about over 2 decades. And I was plugged in. It wasn't, I mean, if somebody's corrupt in a police department and they get investigated and then they get indicted or charged, everybody knows about it. I mean, it's going to be all over the news, but you also know within your...
That's more black and white when it's actually a cop doing something. But what about when you have these like informants? Like that's where the lines get blurred. And I think when you get these bigger organizations like the FBI and the CIA, and who's policing them? Are they policing each other? And then you have these big time gangster people that are maybe they say they're an informant for the FBI or they're giving the FBI information, but they're still criminals. Like I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking of an example, like in the movie The Departed, where, I mean, spoiler alert, but like Jack Nicholson at the end, they're like, wait, are you an FBI informant? And he's like, he's cutting people's hands off. He's killing people. He's doing he's dealing drugs. He's doing all these terrible things. But the FBI is like in bed with him. Like, I mean, it's like, that's where the lines get blurred to me. And it seems confusing. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy?
So that's that's an incredible movie. Sadly,
right?
It's loosely based on like Whitey Bulger and the information he was providing to an FBI agent. And that's a whole nother topic. And what was going on? Because
that guy avoided, being arrested for like most of his career, like 30 or 40 years. And then when he was on the run and hiding. But I think for like 30 or 40 years, they never even came after him. Like he would walk out into the city and say, I own this city. Like, cause he had everybody, the cops and everyone paid for somehow. Right.
Well, if I remember right, and man, I don't want to speak incorrectly, but I think what was going on is he was providing information to an agent about basically the enemy organization. So he was providing really good information to the agent. The agent can then make really good arrest. I guess I say really good, but I think effective arrest in against another organization.
So it's actually helping him out though to do that.
What's that?
He's eliminating the competition.
Basically, yes. Oh yeah. And so anybody that works informants knows it's the enemy of my enemy is my asset. Right. That was my thing. Like when I developed gang members into informants, I knew a lot of times we had the same interest in the sense of if, say, a certain blood set was beefing or going to war with another blood set, it happens. So when I say set, I'm talking about a small organization within a larger branch. So, but when one goes to war with another one, they're in constant feuding, and you develop somebody into a source or an informant, they now really what they want to do is they don't want to obviously give dirt and provide information on their own set, on their own organization, because that's their friends. You know, they're kind of going to war with their friends.
Right.
But they will give you as much dirt as possible on the enemy. So in a lot of times,
It
guys
takes out the
know.
competition. Like, but
Yeah.
so
So
did
guess
they
what?
also get some sort of like if they do get arrested, then they would that would help them their case so they get a lesser sentence?
It can be. So let's keep it simple. Everybody, historically Bloods and Crips have feuded. It's not always the case in different cities, but for this purpose, let's say a set of Bloods and a set of Crips are going to war. If I develop an informant in this set of Bloods and one Crip, informant in this set of Crips, and they're giving me information, guess what's happening? I'm eliminating both sides. Boom, boom, boom. And so, like, what I teach in class is like, you're part of like the most violent game of dodgeball possible. So really, that's all you're doing. You're trying to get people off of the criminal landscape as quick as you can when there's ongoing feuds. And what I mean by that is like a shooting happens on a Monday night, Tuesday night, the retaliatory shooting happens, by Wednesday, another shooting. So you get caught in these cycles. And then sometimes let it pop off on like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, and you'll have a club getting shot up with 3 or 4 people shot. And so you want to get ahead of that and you want to disrupt that cycle of violence. Well, the best way to do it, or one of the best ways, is to develop multiple sources or multiple informants within both of those rival gangs. So you may have an informant who's a brand new entry level foot soldier, so to speak. Then you could flip also one that's in middle management and one that's in the higher echelons. So if I've got 3 or 4 informants in this Blood set, 3 or 4 in this Crip set, and I'm checking everybody's info and I'm feeding it to proactive units who are going out there and making arrests on gun charges, existing warrants, doing, feeding information to a drug unit so they can do a search warrant or hit a hotel room. It's constant disruption like that. And so that's the art of developing informants. And so what you always have to do is you have to understand who is providing information to you and why. So if I know their motivation for providing me information is self-preservation, man, I'm just like I'm spitting bars. But if they give information about the enemy, that makes sense to me. Okay, I'm good with that. Now, you'd mentioned if they have an existing charge. So this is where things can get a little strange when people are reading news stories or you're hearing about informants cooperating or doing work. If someone has an existing drug charge, in some jurisdictions, they're the person who's charged, their attorney can work with the prosecutor and they can basically make a contract and say, the defendant, let's say the gang member, is pleading guilty to this drug charge, right? Selling or possess and sell with intent to deliver, whatever, drugs. They plead guilty to that. And part of that is they're going to work off their charges, meaning now they have to basically produce 3 other cases, right? So in the drug world, a lot of the techniques have been, if somebody gets arrested with, an ounce of coke, well, then a lot of times drug detectives want them, hey, can you buy from 3 different people and can you bump it up to 2 ounces, 3 ounces? It's always about weight, getting more and more weight drugs. I'm going to come back to that in the whole war on drugs and actually how drug charges should be used. But that's how someone who's working as an informant kind of works off their charges is kind of how people phrase it, or substantial. So they're working substantial. That's oftentimes like what people call a quick flip. This is a person who's arrested on drug charges. They cooperate only to save their own self. So they may actually go and do controlled buys and stuff from other drug dealers that they don't really care about. And they don't care if that person goes to prison as long as they themselves don't have to go. And that's a quick flip. Boom, it's done. There's not a whole lot to that. There are a lot of checks and balances, and you do have to search people before, informants before they go do buys and stuff. Like there are checks to know that they're not going and doing false buys and buying fake drugs and things like that just to get credit. There's also a way to be able to get information from gang members over many years that you don't have to do contracts like that. It's just building rapport. It's just providing information. And sometimes gang members are in horrible situations where they're stressed out. They know they're in a gang that is using and abusing them. So in essence, they basically become a disgruntled worker. So think about, even in the workforce, you work at a company, maybe you're assembling car parts, or you're working at UPS and you're loading or unloading trucks. And the person next to you loading, their truck is disgruntled and upset, but they still stick with the company. Well, what happens when FedEx comes along and says, hey, UPS employee, what do you like about your job? I like getting paid. I like having a job, but I really hate the people I work with. And my supervisor is absolutely horrible. He yells and screams at me all the time. And I feel like I'm not even getting paid enough, but I need a job. And then FedEx says, why don't you come work for us? We'll pay you more and we'll let you meet your supervisor. Nice person. And as a matter of fact, in 6 months, maybe less, you could take that supervisor's position. It's a great sales pitch. The same thing goes on in the gang world. Bloods, Crips, Sureños, Gangster Disciples, Lat Kings, Vice Lords, all of them. Guys can get disgruntled in the set, the smaller branch of the organization. And they look to flip or pancake out from that group and join another group. Yeah. So
That's
once
crazy.
you start to get involved and you kind of understand this person is disgruntled and upset with their own organization and they want to leave, that's one way they can leave.
Yeah. Well, so sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say the other thing about that is, if they're still in that set or that gang and they're disgruntled and the right person approaches them, they can develop them into a really good source. And then a person sometimes is kind of working for free. They're just providing information because they're surrounded by a bunch of jackals, sharks, and they don't want to get eaten. Not everybody that joins a gang is a psychopathic killer who wants to ride around shooting people. Probably only about 5 to 10%, and a lot of them.
So which gang has the most crazy psychopathic killers? Like, what is the gang that you would be the most scared of if you ran into them in an alleyway late at night?
Dude, that could be any gang. And the reason I say that, each gang operates a little differently in their culture. So at one point, several years ago, MS-13 was spreading across the country. I mean, they've been spreading for about 20 years, but there were campaigns like that where they were using machetes, cutting their enemies, really trying to do kind of like the psychological operations on them. And then President Trump, during his first election, had basically labeled them public enemy number one. And when he did that, like it was kind of a wake-up call for everybody, I think, in the country to realize, hey, this gang that started out in the early 80s in Los Angeles with a bunch of kids who were into like heavy metal, and their families had fled El Salvador, during the battles down there in the Civil War. But those kids in LA were getting beat up and jumped by other gang members like 18th Street, Bloods and Crips and stuff. So they formed what eventually becomes MS-13. But it grows like wildfire. But when they go on a terror campaign like that, yeah, that's a different level of fear and violence. But in any city, if a leader is recruiting or wants, real shooters in their set, they'll go out and find those psychopaths because everybody, talks. And there's always that kid that kind of grows up fighting, prone to violence. First chance he gets, he grabs a gun. He starts popping shots to clear the block. It was like one of the things, like we would go to shots fired and you get there and everybody's scattered. Then you talk to some sources and you find out later some 12-year-old kid got mad at somebody, grabbed his brother's burner or his brother's gun, goes out and just fires it in the air and clears the block. And then he's like, all right, now I got a little power. And then the next thing you know, by 14, 15, 16, he's shooting people. And so it just depends. I mean, each organization has their psychopaths. They have their shooters, so to speak. And they can do some really diabolical stuff.
Well, what is the scariest thing that you've seen? Like, I mean, you talk about Naco had the guy with the head. Well, I mean, what if you walked into the crime scene and seen something just that scared the shit out of you, like a horror movie?
Not so much with gang members in the sense of sheer violence, like cutting up and stabbing. I mean, that has happened in other jurisdictions. And I think if you get down to the brass tacks of it, those individuals, if you were to analyze them, were, antisocial personality disorder all day. So they were already prone to that. They were going to do that to whoever made them mad. They just happened to join the gang. But there was a story of MS guys who had done a murder in North Carolina. And then they got one of the guys, if I remember right, had fled and made it down to El Salvador, but then got detained or arrested and was in a prison down there. And when detectives and prosecutors went down to talk to him and interview him, they said, hey, just be aware that less than probably like a week ago or whatever it was, he and a couple of his buddies cut the head off of one of the enemy inmates and were playing soccer with it. And so it was like, and there's a documentary made about it. I want to say National Geographic made it. But it was an eye opener for people to understand that MS was operating in the South. And not only were they operating in the South, they were putting people in the ground. And at that time, I want to say out of Charlotte, Mecklenburg area, North Carolina, they were running a RICO investigation. So they had an FBI task force with Charlotte police officers and probably some other agencies. So they were already investigating that clique or that little set of MS-13 guys. So, and if I remember right, out of that case, one of the guys or both of them were charged with murder and sentenced to death. And I think that was the first capital punishment case for a street gang federally in the U.S. And during that case, one of those guys, one of the MS guys, they were going to have an informant testify, so he had to be able to take the stand. And when they were bringing one of the inmates in, one of the MS guys, Marshall had searched him and found a little shank, like a homemade knife that he was hiding on the shaft of his penis. Yeah. And what he was going to do was pull it out and in the middle of this federal court trial, lunge over and cut and kill the informant or the rat, as he would say. I mean, that type of diabolicalness. So, but I mean, any gang's capable of that. There've been a gang out of the Wake Forest, Raleigh area in North Carolina, a set of Bloods that kidnapped a prosecutor's father out of his home, took him to Atlanta, and held him captive for 5 days. And then the FBI, they were involved from the very beginning. And the HRT team hit, I think, 3 different apartment units at the same time to recover the father. And he was still alive. So, and that investigation, person that kind of mastermind that, horrible person, had been in a gang all his life. So they evolve, they use technology. They're, trying to gather information on police officers and agents constantly. They try to figure out where they live. They'll threaten stuff like that. They'll threaten to come to your house, and kill you or harm you. So, I mean, that's part of the game there. Everybody knows that. You do checks and balances, and, sometimes you let them know, hey, come on.
Yeah, I mean, that's something you've always got to kind of be looking over your shoulder, right? Because you've probably put some people away.
Yeah, and that's the thing, too, is that I never worried as much about the individuals I had encounters with, because I always did my best to show respect, even with people I had to fight, even when I was recovering guns off of people or chasing them or car chasing. The dust is settled. You lost. Train up, get better. There's no reason I should have caught you with all this gear, but I did. We're cool with it. Like, now let's work on getting to the jail. I'll talk to the magistrate. You know, you did run from us, so don't expect a low bond. They're not going to give you a low bond, you know, but you got to be thinking about these things that's going on in your life right now. And then, you know, a lot of times I would have very personal conversations and get in the weeds of their life. If they started talking, then that's what we would talk about. It's like, you know, because I'd learned a lot more about gangs than a lot of the other officers they would encounter, I could then kind of impress them, so to speak, with my knowledge and then put them at ease. And so then I could even talk about certain rules maybe that they were breaking on their own behavior. You know, hey, you had a blue flag on you. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
you got, you know, 8 tray tattooed on your fist. Like, you're already letting the world know you're 8 tray gangster crip. And now you're going to go out here and do this and draw all this attention and heat on your set. Like, you're violating your own code, so to speak. So, but then get to the root of what do you got going on in your life, your personal life, kids that maybe you're raising. Are you actually, you know, employed? Do you have a job? What's your goals? You know, what, like, and I would ask people sometimes, like, man, like, legit, if I could make anything, like, if I could make any wish come true for you or help you out in any way possible, but like, what would you want changed? And believe it or not, like, a lot of guys don't get like adult attention from a person who's not living that same lifestyle. So even asking a question like that, which sounds crazy, all they got, I mean, they can always just say no, or man, that's some corny, you know, stuff, man. Like, I ain't gonna talk to you. Like, okay, well, cool. Yeah, enjoy the ride. We'll go to the jail, get you processed. You know, just know when I see you on the block, like, I know everything about you. I know your set. I know your rank. I know what your ambitions are. I know what your worst fears are. Like, I just hate to see you go down this path, but that's the path you choose. Just know it's only going to get worse the longer you stay in this organization, because at any given time, we will make them number one on our chart, and then we will do everything we can to dismantle it completely. So that means you will either see federal time in long-term investigations, or you will see state time for your gun charges, your murders, your shootings, your robberies, anything you're tied into. We'll dig and dig and dig until we find it. And setting that tone so that they fully understand you are on the losing end of this. There's no way you're winning, because you're closed off secret society gang. Now I know all the secrets, and my colleagues know all these secrets.
So is that kind of like the Whitey Bulgers, who, again, he was basically a criminal and a gangster until until he was 60 years old, and then he retired on the run for 20 years and hiding. Is that kind of a thing of the past? Because it just seems like, especially now with all the DNA evidence and murders, like all these gangster movies you see back in the day, they'd kill like multiple people, like Sopranos. I'm like, there's no way that there could be a Sopranos now. Like, all these murders, like, they would find the DNA evidence and they'd lock all these gangsters up.
Yeah, it's definitely, I don't want to say easier, but a lot more effective doing police investigations now than 40, 50, 60 years ago, because of technology, but also because if you have a really solid police department and they've got really good gang units, you know, gang intelligence, and that's the other thing, like, that a lot of departments, they get away from that. They're like, we don't need to tie up detectives and officers working this gang intel stuff. Like, who really cares? If they commit a robbery, we'll just solve the robbery and we'll arrest them for it, and the problem goes away. And but the idea is, if you're working intel and you fully know what's going on, as much as possible in that criminal organization, then you can start to do things to break it apart through very strategic arrest, through convincing some members, hey, you don't have the heart. Like, you're kind of half-assing this. And this is not a world you want to be in. The same way like when I call for a check-in or I call for backup on my radio, I don't want some scrub rolling up, barely getting out of the car, out of shape. They don't care. They don't want to fight. They don't want to chase somebody. I don't want them. And you don't have the heart and full commitment for the gang. So you need to be thinking about your exit strategy. You need to think about how many years you're willing to do in state prison or federal prison on behalf of the gang. And if it's life in prison or 20 years, cool. If it's the answer is, man, I ain't trying to do 1 day for this set. Well, then, okay, let's start talking about that exit. So 40, 50, 60 years ago, like when Whitey Bulger and these crews like up in Boston, when they're putting bodies in the ground, yeah, it probably was a lot harder to be able to charge because you don't have necessarily that technology. You have the technology now, but where a lot of departments are failing is to be able to get people to testify or to be able to get to the root problem or the root cause in, say, a homicide investigation or a shooting.
Is it hard to convict without a body? Because that's one thing that I feel like maybe that that's how they evade being arrested, right? Because like, I don't know if you followed the news like a few years ago over here. No, I mean, technically it's Nevada, but like Vegas, that Lake Mead was drying up and they found these barrels and there was dead bodies in them. And it was like, that's how the Vegas mob was getting rid of the bodies, where they were putting them in these barrels and dumping them in the lake, and nobody would ever find it until the lake dries up. Like have you ever seen things like that? Like, what's the most clever way that you've seen that, I guess, or maybe you never knew where they got rid of a body?
Oh, well, I mean, there are cases of people being dismembered. Usually is kind of the most effective way people think of being able to get rid of the body. The problem is when you're dismantling a body, basically, you're still going to have the biohazard. You're still going to have the fluids, the blood, and that's going to leave its own marks in a building, in a driveway, in a car, on the soles of shoes that you think you've washed off. I mean, so I can think of when you're talking about like finding bodies, or, hey, is it hard to convict without a body? Most prosecutors will not charge murder unless you have a body, and unless you've got an overwhelming amount of evidence, say a video of
blood, like you said, if there was blood, like a big blood stain with that.
So yeah. So then you have to get into, okay, do we have it on video? Do we have a way to prove that this person was actually murdered and not that we're just dealing with the missing person case? So if blood gets involved, it's got to be one of those where if the carpet is saturated and you start to cut up the carpet in the crime scene, or say that the sheets and the blanket and the mattress, the bed, then your crime scene techs and your labs are going to be looking at that and going, okay, the human body only holds X number, liters of blood. And therefore this all seems to test to be the one person's blood. Therefore we think they bled out. Right. But if you don't have the body, you now have to one, you don't ever want to get it wrong. And that's the big thing that I think a lot of people get frustrated about. And Andrea and I both do a show on Tuesday nights, Night Shift with Andrea up late. And that's what we cover, a lot of unsolved cases or solved cases that are pretty heinous, or sometimes missing person cases. And so if somebody is missing and it seems to be that they were murdered, there still can be possibilities of people disappearing because they don't want to live the life they're living.
Oh.
So if you're a prosecutor and you're a homicide unit and you charge somebody with murder without having the body, in my world, normally you don't have 100% confirmation that this person is dead.
What do they typically do with gangs, though? Do they just shoot them in their home and leave them in their home like that? Or do they try to get rid of the body like the Vegas where they dump the barrel in the ocean or the lake or whatever?
Yeah, so it does depend. Like a lot of my experience was like hit and runs. Like guys would just dump around, shoot somebody, and that was it. Or stab them, cut them. Latin Kings out of New York years ago, probably 20, 30 years ago, were tied into long scale investigations. But part of what came out of that investigation is they were killing their own members at the orders of one of their higher ups, one of their Incas, like a higher ranking Latin King. And they were cutting hands off of the victims, trying to prevent them from ever being identified, through their fingerprints and stuff.
Why would they killing their own members? Just because they didn't follow the rules or something? Or?
Yeah, didn't follow the rules. Or sometimes, and in that case, I think part of what they were learning is that the higher ranking member was becoming paranoid. And so he was starting to kind of give out that what they call like a spring cleaning list, like, hey, we got to get rid of these people. And sometimes it can be to instill fear within the ranks of the organizations. Like, hey, I'm going to show you got to tighten up, basically. So it's almost like just disciplinary. But usually if it's murder, then someone's done something so egregious, the gang feels like or thinks they've informed on them. So like I did, I'll just say that I assisted with a unit on a larger scale murder of an informant, FBI informant. And that was pretty bad because it was like one of that. It's like the set itself thought this guy was an informant and they lured him several states away and killed him.
How did they kill him?
They shot and killed him. Basically, there were 2 carloads, if I remember right, and they were in a southern city, a city that they had, none of them had ever been to. So they had taken him down there apparently to kill him, or at least that was, I think, the plan.
Why a different city? Just to make it harder to solve the case? Or
yeah, I mean, because most like gang members learn, the really good ones who survive to get into their 20s and 30s learn every police encounter, we're gathering more and more information. And so we know when someone's on the block or someone's hanging out, you, as a really good officer and detective, you can watch surveillance footage of a shooting or a drug deal, whatever, an assault from like a gas station camera. And you can be like, boom, that's so-and-so. Because you see the dudes every day. You know their gait, their walk, their tics, their behaviors, what they do, how they carry themselves. So it starts to become just like if you saw a coworker on a video, you're like, oh yeah, I know that person. Like, even though their face may even be a little blurry, it's like just how they're walking and how they're moving. But yeah, it's this idea of, when you're dealing with gangs and the violence, that violence that is projected on the enemies is also projected inwards. And so that is also a really big fear that gang members have, is like almost like you can't trust anyone because of stories in your own set or your own gang where a buddy or someone has been killed and the story put out was, hey, they were snitching. And really some of these cases you get down to it and it's like, they didn't violate any codes. They weren't snitching. They were sleeping with this ranking member's cousin or something, a girlfriend, and they find out and it's more personal. Well, they can't use the gang for personal gain like that. So they cook up a story and say, he's snitching or he's informing. So we got to do something. Or, hey, I shot and killed him because he was an informant.
Yeah.
And sometimes, guys look sideways like, there were rumors that dude was messing with your girlfriend or something like that, So
it's like, if you're a gang member, you'll not only have to worry about the police, you got to worry about rival gangs, and then you got to worry about your own gang too. Like,
yeah,
it's kind of a lot of hazards.
Yeah, and one of the things that I talk about a lot of times with gang members is the psychological effects, the anxiety, the worry, that then manifest in their body, the physical ailments they start to have, but that paranoia is real. And for people who actually care about themselves and they don't just live on adrenaline rushes and go out and just love getting shot at and shooting people, because there are some people that love that, like they're just complete reckless. But the ones who don't like that, it eats them up. And after a while, they start using harder drugs, or they start to kind of be manipulated by the gang because the gang knows, like, hey, they used to be solid. They used to be on their A game, but now, like they're not showering as much, or, when I call or text, they're acting all paranoid and just kind of like freaking out on me or that sort of thing. And so as that starts to happen and the older and older they get, the worse it can get, because it's like being burned out. It's like you had mentioned The Departed. When you watch it, I I forget the Leonardo DiCaprio. He's the cop, or who's actually undercover, and nobody really knows he's a cop, kind of thing. But it starts to eat at him, and that paranoia and everything is really getting to him. It's the same way in the gang world. So that there were informants, that would say, "Hey, I got to tap out. Like I can't do this. I can't survive my own gang, the enemy, and also the worry that they're ever going to figure out that I'm an informant."
Yeah,
so I was always
that's
like, "Hey,
crazy."
Well,
So
I would always
the-
tell them that, like, look, then we're done. That's cool. Like I'm not going to be upset. Like, this is your life. If you don't want to do this, don't do it.
How long do people typically have to be an informant before they have completed the job or whatever?
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. So if they're working some kind of deal, like their charges, that sometimes can be a 12-month period or 18 or whatever, the jurisdiction, the prosecutors and defense work out. I mean, that's between them, but usually it doesn't extend like that. And most people doing that, they try to go in, do those quick buys and be done with it, and kind of burn people that they're not that close with. Gang members that work more long-term, and you can read, I mean, there a lot of indictments and a lot of federal complaints and stuff get posted on the internet, and it'll come out, where a city will do a RICO investigation, or they'll arrest, 20 gang members all at one time under federal statutes. And then you can actually go online and just read those. And those kind of read almost like a nonfiction book, and it outlines the gang and it explains all the crimes they were committing. But then also when those cases go to trial, that's kind of when the public learns, oh, there were actual gang members who had kind of flipped and were cooperating with law enforcement, and were recording things and handing over, their devices and phones or whatever. There's a myriad of things you do, computer extractions, all that stuff. And it's all public knowledge. I'm not giving those secrets away, but those things come out in trials, and then the public kind of learns, oh, for whatever, a year or two, a person was cooperating. So their life changes dramatically psychologically for them, because now they're still operating as a gang member, potentially. They're enemies. If they've got a job, now they got to balance work, getting information, keeping themselves, from getting killed. If they've got a girlfriend, which a lot of gang members have 2 or 3 girlfriends, and then 2 or 3 kids with each of them. So a lot of gang members are bouncing around from different women, and they have kids. And so there's a lot of drama tied into that. So a lot of these guys, the kind of the running joke is always when you arrest somebody and you get them into an interview room and they just put their head down, and it's like they just sleep. And sometimes that's a technique to avoid police talking to them or whatever. But you see it, and sometimes it's just a physical exhaustion of like, finally, I know I'm in a safe room where I'm not going to get shot, stabbed, or, a baby's mama's not going to cut me with a steak knife, or pour Clorox all over my clothes, or bust the windows out of my car. Like, it's just like they just, boom, collapse. And sometimes guys will sleep like that for 2 or 3 hours. And you go in there and you conduct an interview, and you just see it all come out, and, they'll confess that they did their part of the shooting or their part of the murder or whatever. But then also just the other side effects of that, where a lot of times guys will start crying and saying, hey, I know I'm going away. Like, I got to go lay down for 10 or 12 years, but I just want to talk to, my mom, or I want to talk to my grandmother. Can I make a phone call to my girlfriend, or my son, or whatever it is? And that's the side of it too, where you just see the psychological effects, and you're just like, man, it's always being on that edge, and dudes get burned out by that. And that's a really good way too, to talk to gang members and explain to them there's always a way out. Like, you may not be able to grasp it and figure out a way right now because you're in day-to-day survival mode. So if that's all you can think about is like, how I'm going to get through the day, you're not even planning out what you're going to do tonight. You're just kind of living in the moment. It's hard to know where you're going to be 5 years from now. But when I'm sitting there talking to someone, I can say, hey, you're whatever, 20 years old right now. This is what's going to happen in the next few months, and then 6 months, or maybe a ranking gang member's getting out of federal prison and coming back and touching down in the city of like, hey, when they get back, you all now have to answer to the things you haven't done, the missions and the orders that have been handed out. And we know for a fact you didn't do, this shooting on this date and time that you were ordered to do. But when he touches down, he's going to want to know personally why you didn't do that. You know what I mean? So then they kind of realize now you're on a time crunch. So you can stay in this gang. And when the mean boss, the mean supervisor returns to the office, so to speak, it's kind of hell to pay. Well, in the gang world, it's like some of these dudes are vicious, and they come back out of being locked up and they're like, hey, I've been putting orders out and y'all haven't been handling business. The money's been wrong, so now y'all are going to pay. And a lot of guys would do things out of fear if their leadership instilled that type, if they were more of an authoritarian leader or a dictator type, as opposed to more charismatic.
So how does that work? Like, because I know with the Italian mafia, they have like the capos or whatever, and they have people, they give orders a certain way so that the boss can't be traced to it. Right. Does that work?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. If the gang puts in play like backstops, like, hey, I can only give orders, or I will only give orders to my second in command. And at that point, the only orders I'm going to give are going to be verbal. I'm never going to call him on the phone. I'm never going to send him text messages or emails or social media, direct messages, anything that can digitally be traced, or any phone call that could be monitored. So a lot of people are like, well, okay.
But couldn't you guys listen in on, like in The Sopranos, they put a thing in the lamp or whatever in his basement?
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't if you get a warrant, can't you put a recording device anywhere?
Every jurisdiction is a little different with that. And so basically you have to be able to articulate that type level of a threat. I personally have never worked a case where we put a device inside of someone's home. Those cases go on. I'm just saying each jurisdiction is different. When you get into the like the criminal motorcycle world, so you get like Hells Angels, Outlaws, Mongols, Vagos, Banditos, Wheels of Soul, like all these clubs that have expanded from California, Texas, like they're in all these different states. And out in our area, out here in the South, we've got all those major clubs have chapters out here. That's where you start to get into the investigations where potentially ATF agent goes undercover and actually works an entire club, like say the Mongols. And so they would live a life and get it in and go through the probationary period and become an actual patched in member of the Mongols. And then at a later date, everybody gets rounded up and charged on, federal RICO charges. And they did it with the mafia, like you had mentioned. And so sometimes with stuff like that, there can be devices inside of some structures that are recording things.
Is the Italian mafia, is that even still a thing? Because you just don't really hear about it anymore. Are they just more underground? Or are they doing things that, like, because I feel like a lot of the money making stuff now is like, it's like legal. Like if you can lobby against with the DC, I feel like a lot of the organizations like insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies, I mean, I feel like these are mafias in my opinion. Like I think you make way more money in pharmaceutical and insurance than you would say selling cocaine or heroin. But is the Italian mafia a thing anymore, or what do they do?
Yeah, I think they're still around. It's just like anything. And oftentimes, like there are TV shows about the FBI and these federal agencies and the investigations they run. But if you hammer, one of the families and they get hit with a RICO, the entire organization doesn't go away, but it's hard to function the way they did prior to getting arrested. So if you're making these strategic arrests within the organization, it's almost like it crumbles for a little while. It has to kind of revamp. It learns from the trials and the discovery, the evidence that the defendant gets to see. And then they change a lot of times the way they operate. And so then they figure out, like you heard me mention, some gang members will only give, like the higher ranking members may only give orders to their second in command verbally. And so they won't do the other techniques because they've learned through trials, oh, they did a phone extraction and they saw everything in my phone, and they saw, my computer extraction. They saw actual emails where we're emailing one another gang information, and so they were able to use that against me. And, so they learn that and they start to adapt. And what it can do is slow down the growth of any organization because everything's verbal now. And so when that second in command gets the verbal order and he passes it down to his 2 or 3 next ones in command, he's now, if he sends it out digitally, he's going to be held responsible, so to speak, right? So it starts to kind of break down those lines of communication. And that'll go on for 6 months, a year, or something. And then they'll realize we can't keep operating like this. We're going back to using phones. I'll go back to emailing you or whatever. We'll have a side chatter on some social media account, that sort of thing. And then they get back into those practices they were doing before.
So what are the typical practices for, say, the Italian mafia or the MS-13 or Hell's Angels? Like, is it mostly just drugs, robbery, the typical kinds of things, or is there other like scams or things that they're doing now?
Yeah.
With the technology, I would just think there's a lot of like, I mean, did you see the recent thing where the lady got scammed by a Brad Pitt? They made Brad Pitt AI images and said he was sick in the hospital, and Angelina Jolie took all his money and she gave him $700,000. Like, is there some those kind of scams that use the modern technology that are associated with gangs?
Yeah, they're and every organization is different, their culture. So when someone says something about La Cosa Nostra or the mafia, and then say Hell's Angels or Mongols or whatever, and then Bloods and Crips, like those members would tell you, hey, don't lump me in with biker clubs and street gangs, and Bloods and Crips would be like, yeah, we're not on motorcycles, or I'm not a mafia or whatever, that sort of thing. And they are, culturally different. Like their organizations run different in that sense. But a lot of rackets where a bike club, and this is going back for decades, but they may go into an area, or Whitey Bulger, I think part of his run is that his members would go to businesses, and when they go into the business, they would say, hey, like, this is a rough neighborhood. You're probably going to need someone to protect you. And the stores would be like, we don't need protection. We've been open for, 10 years. We've never had a problem. And they go, oh, well, yeah, it's bad because people will vandalize your business. But if you pay me X number of dollars, I'll make sure your business is good. Well, guess what? When they don't pay, they're like, okay. And then the next night or 2 nights later, a brick's thrown through the window and, and it's threatening their lives. And they're like, oh, well, we'll handle that for you. So they create the problem that then they charge the businesses to pay for protection. And that's kind of a rudimentary example, but Bloods and Crips and other like what's kind of categorized in society as street gangs did evolve over the last 10 or 15 years. And you saw this evolution from street dealer of especially crack cocaine that was just wide open for so many decades, transition into heroin, pills. And then the younger generation, and we would hear it on phone conversations and hear it in debriefs where the older generation of gang members were getting upset at the younger generation and saying, hey, why aren't you out there running the block, or why aren't you still operating out of this hotel? Like, we worked hard to get this corner or this hotel to sell crack and sell Molly and stuff. And, we make our money that way. You give up that territory or that area to another gang, like, we can't make money. And the younger generation is like, I'm not trying to twist baggies and spit 20s, like sell crack and Molly. They're like, I'm trying to get free bands. Like, I'm gonna show you how I steal someone's identity and get 30 grand before tomorrow morning. And if I get arrested, it's white collar crime. So I might do 6 months, if even that. And they're right. Like, they were doing a lot of frauds at a certain level to try to stay off of the radar, so that even if they do get arrested, that the bank tries to cover that stuff, cover the loss. And then a lot of departments don't have enough fraud detectives to be able to indict or charge on those cases. And so they were right when they were talking about, hey, I'm not going to be doing years in prison because I have one crack rock in my pocket and I'm a 3-time convicted felon. Like, I'm walking down the street and I'm going to go buy a Hellcat and drive it all over town. And then when I get bored with that one, I'm going to go buy another one. And so we had guys that were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on frauds, and then teaching other gang members the same. They would teach them the fraud techniques the way crack dealers would teach how to cook up crack in the Pyrex dish, how to break it up. Are you going to just spit the 20 out of your mouth or recover the 20 from your stash spot and give it to the customer? Or are you going to let them actually pick their own crack rock out of your hand because that's good customer service? Like, these are all trades that were handed down from one generation to another. Like, just like I said earlier with police work, we try to hand down our knowledge to the next generation. And when you don't, then they're at a loss. So if a gang doesn't evolve that way, then they kind of get decimated. And that's how drug charges should be used. Like I'd mentioned earlier, to dismantle gangs. Go after your most violent gang members. If they're selling drugs, then you go after them with a drug charge. And you don't necessarily worry about, can I get them up to 3 or 4 ounces of Coke? Like, sometimes 1 gram bag of Coke or crack or heroin or fentanyl or whatever will do the trick. It's just putting forth that effort. It may take you 3-4 days, a week to get them on a drug charge. But if they're violent, then boom, they're gone. Like, what difference does it make if a drug unit comes in with 12 kilos of pure powder cocaine?
Yeah.
If it's from someone who is not violent.
It sounds like it's smarter to do the more fraud and white collar crime and that kind of stuff and those kinds of scams versus like the drugs and robbery and especially like armed robbery or violent crime. Like, that's going to be much riskier and not as profitable.
Yeah.
Like, if you not have a convenience store now, what is that? Like a few hundred, where, like you're saying, of the identity theft, I mean, that's like 30 grand probably or more.
Oh yeah. When guys hit convenience stores or the term casinos, which are really sweepstakes places down here in the South, like, you go in and you play these games of chance that are digital, but they call them casinos. So they were like, yeah, so-and-so hit that casino. And then you go, oh yeah, no, we had a sweepstakes robbery and 3 guys.
Wait, what's the difference between a sweepstakes and explain this?
Okay. So they're called sweepstakes businesses.
Sweepstakes.
And so really what someone does is they buy or rent a small unit in a strip mall, usually, and they put bright LED lights up, and it'll be like whatever, Joe's sweepstakes. And so when you go in, oftentimes, if they're doing it right, they have one paid security guard at the front door. You walk into a 2-door system. You walk in through the first door, that door locks, and this other door manually is unlocked by a worker inside the business. But while you're in that little trap there, they ask for your ID, and you show it to a little camera, or you hold it up to the person on the other side of the glass. And then they actually document who you are. You then go into a room, and there are games that you can play that are almost like, I don't know, like digital poker games, fish tables where these fish are going around and eating one another, and you're really just kind of placing bets on which fish is going to get eaten, or making these bets. Is this only
a North Carolina thing? I've never heard of this.
Yeah. I think it's across other states. I think South Carolina and maybe Georgia. And what they were doing is a lot of the states were trying to make laws against these establishments, because what was happening, people would go in and say, like at the fish table, their fish eats whatever, and all of a sudden they make $3,000. So they basically get a printout or it registers and says, hey, you just won $3,000. Well, the whole place knows you won because you're screaming and yelling. Then you got to go up, and the person working behind the counter has cash money. They pay you cash. So now you have a victim walking out of a business with $3 grand.
So are they typically they're big targets for thieves then?
Yes, huge. So you have a lot of robberies either in the parking lot like that, where someone wins and they walk out to their car and get robbed out in the parking lot, or someone or a crew will go in, rob the place, and then sometimes have their finger on the trigger, poor weapon handling, and the weapon can go off, or on purpose they shoot somebody and then they just take $30,000-$40,000 in cash and then beat feet. And so what was happening is, as these sweepstakes places were open, they were drawing a lot of crime, stuff like that. And you would also have people in there playing all day and night, and then they would get mad or frustrated and they start fighting with people, and then they have to get thrown out, or they're fighting in the parking lot, or you've got gang members that just hang out there in general because it's fun to gamble. And then they got beef with someone and they cross paths with a rival gang member, and you got a shootout in the middle of a parking lot or inside of the sweepstakes place. So it was
I'm just trying to find this. I'm so curious, like, because I've been in North Carolina, I don't remember seeing these. So they call them casinos?
No, that's the street term. That's what gang members call them.
Okay.
Yeah, because it sounds better.
It's actually called sweep. If I Google North Carolina sweepstakes, something should come up.
Yeah, you should see that. But yeah, a lot of states, I think, in jurisdictions tried to pass laws, and I think some of them may have been successful to get them shut down for that purpose, because they deal strictly in cash. So that's one of those things that if someone's got a lot of money, then they're gonna hit it, and it's can be a big payoff. But also, what a lot of guys don't realize, anytime gang members rob a business, oftentimes that robbery can be adopted under federal charges. And so they end up getting charged federally because it has something to do with the interstate commerce. And so it's like Hobbs Act is what they call it. So then they get bound over to the federal side. And so when they go in and rob a sweepstakes place or a gas station, or sometimes like a Domino's or like these pizza establishments, whatever, it can get bound over and then adopted federally. And so then they're one robbery that, like you said earlier, they may rob a chain of, a franchise gas station, and they rob it and get $600 cash. And then they get convicted and they do 7 years in federal prison or more because they did an armed robbery. So when
have you seen that movie, The Chiefsaholic? Have you watched that yet?
I have not.
Oh, you got to see that. It's so good. It's about that. Have you heard the story about the Kansas City Chiefs fan who robbed banks?
No.
It's so crazy. Yeah, this guy was a diehard Chiefs fan. He dressed up he had like a Wolf's costume, and he would go to every game. He was at the home games and the away games. And then there was this bank robber, and he was wearing the same outfit that he wore to the games to rob the banks. And so then he was betting all this money. Like, he'd rob the bank and he'd bet, like, Chiefs to win this game, 30 grand or whatever. And you talk about, I think you'd really enjoy it too, because it looks at the guy's like personal life and stuff. And it's like, because he seems like such a nice guy. You're like, why did he do these armed bank robberies? And it's such an interesting, fascinating story. I feel like we didn't get the full story, like why he went to this life of crime. It was just because he wasn't a gang. There wasn't a bunch of people convincing him to do it, but he chose to just do this crazy life. And now they're saying he could face like 30 years in prison or something like that.
Yeah. Before I address that, Andrea in the chat comments said that you won't see those.
I saw that. Yeah.
she said, I know where to look. So
I Googled one. It said South Beach Sweeps. And it looks like a casino. I mean, that is what it looks like.
Yeah. Some are a little better than others. Most of them I dealt with were pretty bare bones, to the point where sometimes the businesses, like, we would go in and do a search warrant, or, go in for the crime scene itself when there was a murder or shooting or whatever. And there would be, it felt like 400 pizza boxes in the back. And you're like, what in the world? And what they were doing is actually ordering like 20 pizzas at a time. And then people would come up and pay per slice. You know what I mean? So it's like they even had like a side racket going, selling pizzas, but they couldn't cook them in there because it's just a small business. So just stuff like that. Like people are always working these hustles. But yeah, it was one of those things. One of the comments earlier, and I was going to address it, was in reference to Louisville or Louisville, however you pronounce it. I think, or either St. Louis, and I apologize. One of the comments earlier had asked about the number of gangs in that area. And I think that the comment had said that there were 28 gangs identified in that area. I can tell you that the city I worked in, a pretty large city in the South, and we have right around 55 gangs that I could articulate and say, that is, 9 Trey Blood, G Shine Blood, 8 Trey Gangster Crip, Rolling City.
And too, the phrases and the signs and the symbols and all that. It reminds me of that Seinfeld episode with the Van Buren boys. Have you seen that one?
yeah. Like where they throw up the number, right? Like he was the 7th president.
He's the 8th president or whatever. Like I was holding the salt shaker and I had 8 fingers and that was their secret sign. And so, that's like that is like serious stuff, right? There's things like that. Like if you know the secret sign or whatever, they won't stab you to death.
Yeah. Well, what it is that it's just a way, basically that a person can tell the other people what set they are. And it's just fun to do. Like the guys really love doing it. And it just becomes almost like when I tell a story, I got to use my hands, but it starts to become something like that, where they're just flashing these signs. And a lot of times what they're throwing is their sign. Like, so if someone is like just generically, like they're just a blood, but then it falls down into what nation, or out on the West Coast, it will be what gang or what set. Like on the East Coast, you would have guys that could be blood, which is an overarching term. So it's kind of like a profession. So if someone says, "Oh, I'm a cop," well, the next question is, "Well, where do you work?" Right? "Oh, I work at this police department." "Oh, what do you do?" "I'm in the detective division and I'm a homicide detective." So now I've identified my profession as police work, but this is the department I work in, the division, and my actual unit, my assignment. So if you really wanted to know where I was at any given point when I'm at work, you know right where to go. You know who my people are, who I work with because of that. It's the same way in the gang world. So if someone says they're blood, or you identify someone as a blood gang member, that just means it's like that. That's like a profession. We need to know what nation, like out here on the East Coast, or like what set out in the West Coast. So if someone says, "Oh, he's Rolling 20s neighborhood blood," that's an entire gang itself. It has nothing to do with other blood gang sets, or you know what I mean? So there's no such thing as the highest ranking blood. They're not. They're all independent.
Okay. What is the one in Colorado, the Venezuelan gangs that were taking over apartment buildings? I know it was only a handful of them, but I mean, it's still kind of scary, right?
Yeah, that's more the newer phenomenon. So what you're seeing is, like anything, if you study gangs and you see that a population gets kind of uprooted, like I mentioned earlier, so MS-13.
Yeah.
So when families are going through civil wars in a country and they flee, when they start to settle into one area of a city, whoever the criminal element is within that population, they're going to be right there. They're going to band together. The same thing with the gang out of Venezuela. So when they're settling down in one area like that in Colorado, and they're starting to do well-organized home invasions, that's what they've learned to do. I never worked them. My way, like when I was going out the door, I was asked to make a phone call to a citizen as a favor to actually just figure out whatever they were asking about. And the citizen didn't even live in the city I was in, but had ties to the city and knew I knew about gangs, blah, blah, blah. But what they were talking about was their house had been marked. And in their jurisdiction, the local police said, "Yeah, your house is marked. And this mark means they're getting ready to do a burglary. At some point in the future, another crew is going to come through. They're going to see the house is marked, and they'll know exactly which house to hit because of this mark." And it was like just a little quick spray paint. So what they had to do is then kind of harden their surroundings. They had to get video cameras. If I remember right, I think they had even checked into hiring personal security staff. And so then digging into it, then it's like, oh, okay, this trend is going on in other cities, not in the one I was in, but in other cities where it was the Venezuelan gang. And that's what they were doing, is very well orchestrated burglaries. And then you had crews that were doing home invasions. So when you see, this camera footage all over social media in these apartment complexes, and you're seeing 4 or 5 guys stacking up and kicking doors in and stuff, like, people need to really pay attention that this is, that for them, that problem is very specific. And I would not want to be the homeowner who is living in that apartment complex or that area, that part of the city, and I don't have a means to defend myself against 3 or 4 adversaries. And by that, I mean a rifle. So when people get really up in arms and they say, gosh, we've got to get rid of these assault rifles, and if we just make everything illegal, these active shooters will stop and they won't have these weapons with 30 bullets that and my counter is always to that is like, okay, that's the threat you're addressing, but what about the citizen who now lives in a city like that in Colorado? Their number one threat is not an active shooter situation. Their number one threat is a 4 or 5 guys with shiesties on, kicking their door in with Dracos, like getting ready to do some damage. So if the citizen can't defend themselves, and a rifle is an incredible tool to use when 4 people, 5 people are trying to pile through a door, like, I think citizens should have that. That's one, and I got a lot more reasons, but in this realm of firearms and banning and people wanting to revamp, the Second Amendment, like, I believe that is a very effective tool. And moving forward in America, I hope that a lot of citizens fully understand that those capabilities are phenomenal. A really good pistol, if you work with a pistol in your home and like that, like, you've got 4 people coming through the door, you got, say, 15 rounds in a magazine, like, you can do some damage if you know what you're doing. So a lot of people talk about active shooter scenarios as being a kid who snaps and goes into a movie theater or a school or a mall or a grocery store and they just start shooting people. But they don't think about an active shooter is also a gang member running into an apartment complex and shooting up the entire building because they're trying to hit one person, or shoot up a club like guys will do and they hit 4 or 5 people. That's an active shooter. I don't care what you term it. They are shooting, trying to hit somebody, but they have now effectively shot and killed 4 other people or 5 other people. But I'll tell you this, do you think that makes the news a lot?
No, that's what's so interesting. Like, yeah, like Chicago, isn't that where a lot of the murders happen? And I feel like a lot of that doesn't make the news. I had a guy on here, and I forget what his website is. He created this website and this map of mapping out all these murders and stuff. And he thinks there's a serial killer in Chicago, Ohio, somewhere around the Midwest region. And it's basically people that, that the police are not investigating these murders because it's either gang members or homeless people or whatever. They're not, people are not up in arms about these people being killed. So he's able to maybe skirt off the radar. I mean, that's this guy's theory. I don't know.
Yeah. The thing is, when you look at Chicago and you look at their murder rate and what's going on, I mean, in essence, you are dealing with serial killers. You're dealing with some guys that have 3 or 4 bodies on them. Now, you can say what the motives are, and some people would say, oh, well, the motives are their gang doesn't like the other gang. Well, usually it starts to get more interpersonal, and you will find that there are some guys that just enjoy it. So they know in their own set or their own gang, their leader will be like, go handle business because that's what you do. Like one guy was quoted as like, they call me Shooter because Shooter does what Shooter does. And everybody's like, Shooter, what a bland, crazy name for a gamer. He's like, no, I mean, that's what I do. Like, he wasn't fancy. He wasn't any.
How many people do you think he killed?
Oh, there's no telling. Because, I mean, that's the thing is like the younger and younger, sadly, the younger and younger guys that are joining gangs, and not all gangs are going to recruit juveniles. So that's one thing that, like, when I'm teaching my courses and explaining to agents and deputies and officers, it's like, you have to assess the gangs in your city, and you have to understand certain gangs, like say Gangster Disciples, may not be recruiting your teenagers in your city. Your chapter of GDs may actually be recruiting more older teenagers, young adults, and they may be looking more for men who can control their temper. And if they have to commit violence, they're going to do it very quietly. They're going to do it to where it's not going to be tied back to them. Whereas you could have a blood set or a Crip set, they could be actively recruiting young members because they're trying to expand and grow their numbers. And that was what I saw early on in my career, was that there were 2 or 3 blood sets, that were their own chain of command, but that they were recruiting as fast as they could. So we were starting to see 15, 16-year-olds joining, when before, gangs did not necessarily always want to go that young because they couldn't be controlled. But
so do you think the gangs or the number of kids joining gangs, is that increasing or decreasing or staying about the same?
It's increasing. It's absolutely off the charts. But the hard problem is that if I were to go to a city and say, hey, what's your juvenile violence? Like, what have you got going on? Your armed robberies, your shootings, and your homicides. And they'll tell you that if someone is not arrested for the crime, it's hard to say a juvenile committed it. So you literally could have 100 shootings in one city, and they could all be committed by juveniles. But if people aren't being arrested, you can't necessarily prove someone's age, the suspect's age. So someone may say, the dude looked like he was 15. He shot me in the leg and took off running. But for statistic purposes, that's not going to be a juvenile crime. Once someone's arrested, then you can say without a doubt, hey, a 16-year-old committed this murder or shooting or robbery. But what we've seen, again, remember we talked about earlier about trends. So the trend in the last few years is to go really, really light on sentencing, and a lot of cities were trying to revamp what they were doing and how they were doing it. So if you disband a gang unit, and that gang unit, documented their gang encounters, and they could tell you how many gangs were in the city, and they were just locked on, and you disband them, and 2 years later or a year later, you want to do a report inside of your own city, your own department. You say, okay, I want you to pull the numbers on gang members. Well, guess what? If you disbanded your gang unit, you don't really have anybody tracking those gangs and working those gangs. But now when you pull the numbers and say, well, our gang crimes are down. No, they're not. Your shootings, your violence has increased.
Yeah.
You're checking a block, on this category and saying gangs have decreased because really you're just not documenting it. You're not addressing that problem. So, and also a lot of states were reducing the age, increasing the age of arrest. So if a 17-year-old committed a shooting or even committed a arrestable offense 5, 6, 7 years ago, an officer could walk over, put handcuffs on them, and arrest them. Call their parents, say, hey, they're going to the jail. They're going to get processed on whatever. Firearm, possession of a firearm by a minor, simple possession of marijuana, trespassing. These are their charges. Then when states began to raise the age to try to help or try to curb the cycle that youth were getting into by getting arrested at an younger age and getting exposed to the jail system and exposed to, the court system, I think that people, their hearts were in the right place. They were saying, hey, we don't want to see juveniles getting arrested. Like, is there a better way? Well, if we raise the age of physical arrest to 18, which is what most states I think operate on now, then at least the juveniles, when they are committing crimes, they're going to go through a separate court system and a separate custody process. So if they are actually taken into custody, they go to a juvenile facility. And a lot of those jurisdictions were saying, what we're going to do is we're going to basically, I don't want to say disregard a lot of misdemeanors, but they were kind of going, okay, we're not going to allow you to take custody of that 17-year-old simply because they had a firearm during your encounter. Like, we're not going to do that. So you're not going to be able to formally charge them. And so a lot of the charges that juveniles were catching, so to speak, years ago, they were no longer catching them. And so the word got out very quickly, at least in our state and in other states, when I've talked to people, is that, hey, like, these juveniles are realizing very quickly, like, in their minds, the chatter between them on social media and phone extractions, and you read these phone messages, and they're saying, hey, they can't touch us. Like,
and
legit,
so that's also
man.
what you're saying about the gang members targeting the younger kids, because they can use them because, hey, you guys can't be targeted, so you go commit this murder for us.
Yes. So years ago, there was a gang leader who would do that very specifically. And in his meetings, that's what he would say. He would say, you are a juvenile. Like, they're not going to come after you the way they do us. And if you kill somebody, you're only going to get a year or 2 or 3. You won't do life in prison.
Is that real? Is that true?
Well, that was the perspective from them, from the gang members. That's not the truth. So sadly, even now, it's not true that juveniles can't be charged for crimes. It's just a extra added steps where detectives or officers have to go to, like, almost like the equivalent of like a juvenile magistrate, like a person that would hear the probable cause for the charge and then decide whether they're going to allow that juvenile to be charged. And there were a lot of things that changed very quickly in a couple of years. And so that translated on the street to, they can't arrest you. They can't mess with you. And so then a lot of encounters that officers were having with gang members would end up in the use of force, because as the officers went up to make contact, the first thing guys will start screaming is like, yo, you can't touch me. I'm a juvenile. I'm a kid. I'm a kid. I'm a kid. And so you had guys that were 18 lying about their age because they thought, oh, if I tell you I'm 16, you can't even touch me. So that's kind of always been the thing. Well, I say always, but I've had encounters like that where people have started bucking up and saying, I'm a kid, you can't search me. And I've even had one like where we were setting up, I was on a gang unit, and we would do these foot patrols. Like, you start rolling through these areas and you just stand in the shadows and wait. And, you wait 5, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and then some activity happens. And so we were down on this little area, and we knew this house at the end was always having a bunch of problems. Like, there were gangster disciples that would hang out there. And anyway, so we're just kind of watching it from the shadows, and it was just a normal party. Everybody just kind of hanging out, basically grown folks, no real drama. And then a young kid comes out of the house, kind of button hooks around, and we see him adjusting his waistband. And so, like in the police world, like, okay, I know what time it is. Like, he's adjusting a weapon probably in his waistband. That, right? And really what it was a pocket in a very baggy pants. But he's messing with it, and he keeps messing with it. And then he walks back around to the front of the house, and he's got a black bandana folded up, hanging out of the back right pocket. But it's like one of those things where we're like, man, I don't know, dude, this kid's young. Everybody there seems, in their late 20s. Like, yeah, is this somebody's kid? But man, he's got a gun, like straight up got a gun, but he's on private property. Hey, no big deal. Well, then he comes back out of the party, and nobody really wants to talk to him. Nobody knows what's going on with him. And then he starts walking off of the property and kind of up the street, and he gets right onto the street. We go ahead and detain him, because the whole time he's got his right hand on his pocket. So as we detain him, it's one of those where immediately there's enough of us. We snatch him up. You lock his arm, one on each arm. And I'm just explaining to him, you can't move at this point. Stop moving. And so he's trying to like buck up, but he's a smaller guy, and he's not quite sure of his surroundings. But people in the house are starting to get loud, and they're starting to yell, yo, get your hands off him. That's a kid. You can't touch him. Now, we don't want to divert our attention from him to the crowd. That's what our other officers do. And that's why gang units or any proactive units have got to roll around deep like that. They've got to have enough officers. When you make contact, then you've got officers that are now going to pay attention to the outer side. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So myself and this other officer, you're trying to walk him through calmly, like, look, you're going to stop moving your hands. Like, stop. And to the point where I even told him, I know you got a gun in your pocket and you better not reach for it. Stop. But I've got his arm locked down. So we go ahead and we just, you just kind of apply pressure, bent wrist, work him back, and go ahead and cuff him. So, of course, front right pocket, he's got a small pistol. So I go ahead and pull it out. As everything's calm now, he's under control. And I go ahead and clear it. And he's got a round in the chamber. And I hold it up and show the people at the house, like, he's got a gun. Y'all understand that, right? And then everybody's like, oh, he's not mine. He's not mine. Nobody wanted to claim him then. And so later there was some side talk I had with the person over there. And they were like, look, we don't know who that kid is. He walked down here. He just started talking to everybody, like we got nothing to do with him, which I believed him. I was like, okay. And it ended up being the kid was from another town, new to our city, but was a gang member and wanted to just kind of hang out and saw the party, thought he'd, go up and talk. Who knows? But he had a gun in his pocket and they had no clue. Crazy. So it was also one of those where when I explained what we had done, then the citizens kind of understood, okay. And I even said, hey, I mean, would you have wanted us like to just stand back and wait for him to draw the gun and then shoot and kill the kid? Like,
yeah,
the way we handled it didn't look right to you all because you had no clue what we were seeing.
Right.
But we're watching his body language and we know that's indicative.
This is the problem. I feel like a lot of citizens don't know the side of the police. So you see something on the media and you're like, oh my God, the cops are so terrible. And it's like, you're not seeing it from their perspective. And to be fair, maybe people are not, we're not seeing it from the side of the victim sometimes too, but definitely I feel like there's a disconnect there. And I hope that's something that, through podcasts and things like this, that people can start to learn and see each other's perspective and not have this stupid division, be on this side, be again, for cops against cops. Like, no, we're all on the same team. Like it's silly. I hate to see that stuff. So
yeah, it's most of it. If people would just talk and explain their actions on both sides, if police officers, and I think probably now officers do a better job of doing that. I mean, years ago, I would get chastised where officers are like, why are you sitting there still talking? I'm a long talk, I talk a lot anyway, but they're like, why are you still talking to that person? Like, we're going to the jail. Like, they can go down to jail and get them. Like, I know, but if we explain what happened, they have a better perspective. We don't look like we're corrupt cops or that we're lazy. Or like, I would want that. Like,
yeah.
I've had buddies that get arrested, and if someone tells me why they got arrested, then I kind of understand what's going on, Yeah. So it's just one of those things of like, I think body cams have helped a lot when they first came out. Yeah, when they first came
accountability.
out. Yeah, it's accountability.
Somehow magically they get fallen or turned off. But that's not good.
Well, it's also a piece of equipment, and it's one of those things that I think a lot of the newer versions constantly record.
That's good. Yeah.
So what happens is basically, unless you log it digitally, and a lot of the systems are different, but I know that some, like, if it's recording constantly and after like 24 hours, it just records over its material, unless you go into the system and log it and say, basically capture, this date and time, or as they clear a call, like they may manually turn on their camera, and then it's easy because then when they turn it off, it captures it, they log it, and then it's saved or archived. But what can happen is that cycle, 24-hour cycle, the camera is running. Usually there's, it's one of those things where if something happens, they can capture it fast enough. They can go back and say, okay. But what we've learned is that, when they first came out, a lot of people, were like, oh yeah, see, now we're like, you cops got to have cameras on you. Like, I would always tell people, like, since the minute I was a rookie, we had a camera. We had a camera in the car during traffic stops, and there were cameras out on convenience stores. People have video cameras. I mean, like, you do your job as if people were always recording you anyway.
Right. The problem too is I think sometimes these videos are deceptively edited, and you're not seeing the before part. I mean, and it's not only cops, it's just like videos on the internet where you see people in a fight and you're like, well, wait a minute, like this guy just dropped the other guy. Like there must have been some sort of like talking before that, or like something that led up to this fight. Like you're just seeing the part of the fight and you don't see like what they said to provoke them and all that. And that's a huge part of the puzzle. So, and shame on our media for not explaining that and showing these deceptively edited videos just to get higher ratings, like, and stir shit up. Like, oh, that's like disgusting.
It's all of that competition, and they're very good at it. And that's the worst part about it, is that while they're making money and they're growing their channel or their platform, the citizens are suffering, and then officers are suffering. So there were officers that, at times that would just say, everyone hates us. And I'm like, no, they don't. Like, I can take you into some Section 8 housing, and there's going to be one apartment, they're going to hate you, but 30 other apartments out there are not going to hate you. Like, stop buying into this image that everyone hates you. Because I think what was happening is, once the media turned and really realized, man, we can make a lot of money off of just showing these edited clips and doing the headline just right to where you believe you're getting ready to go watch a video of these corrupt, abusive cops killing people, and that trickles down to the officers on patrol, who probably, much like the Vietnam vets felt when they came back home, that, hey, society doesn't care. Nobody wants to talk to us. The college elites at the time were calling them baby killers and stuff. It's like the same thing. People want to bash cops and say across the board, oh, well, y'all love beating people and you're corrupt and you're this and that. And really, even when body cameras started becoming a regular tool, the police corruption was probably at an all-time low. So that's the funny thing, is, like, if you're studying, reported incidents and stuff, these departments were not suffering from massive corruption the way they were in the 90s, the 80s, and 70s. Like, you had the most professional era of police officers going back probably 20 years ago, about a 15-year span of educated, self-motivated, physically fit, like, just hard chargers. A lot, no, not all of them, but that was kind of the culture a lot of departments went to, is like, we want professional police officers. We want people who can throw down if they need to, get in the use of force, articulate it, and be problem solvers, and not go to the same house every day where they got repeat calls. They're going to address that. They're either going to get with the landlord and find out what's going on. They're going to go talk to the mother of the teenagers who were wild and fighting every night. The actual problem solvers. It was an incredible era of police work. And so how that got answered was, people started, media started pushing a really negative narrative that I think a lot of them knew was not true, but they had to compete with so many different platforms that they had to go for that quick fix, like sadly, like a drug addict does. And so that's what they did. And so a lot of them made a lot of money off of it. A lot of cities burned, and some police officers walked away from careers that they really loved doing.
Yeah.
And I hated seeing officers kind of losing that battle. And it was tough. And it's one of those things that I think history will look back and they'll look at, because you got to think 20 years from now, citizens will be able to, extract and watch all these social media videos. And I don't know about TikTok, because I think that's getting shut down. But, this phenomenon of police officers who film themselves dancing or doing whatever and then posting it, or these, they call them TikTok cops, So the era of the TikTok cop is also going to be the same era with police riots and violent crime spiking in cities across the U.S. So the citizen 20 years from now will look at that and go, well, no wonder crime was up. You guys were just standing around dancing and filming yourselves and posting things on, social media. And I think that we have to remember that was not the case. The proactive units were getting disbanded. Chiefs across the country were I think a lot of them were giving in to political pressure to stop going after gang members and drug dealers and buying into this, was it the pipeline to prison theory that was kind of coming out of California. It's like no, these things actually are not true. People
No.
are committing crimes, and police departments are trying to address that, and they prioritize by violent crime and property crime. And so it's like if your violent crime continues on an uptick, you've got to do something. You have to change those strategies, and the strategies can't be disband the units that actually go after and fight and get guns off of people. And so one of those trends was that units or departments were so worried about being the next news story, and they look at their uses of force and they look at their shootings, officer involved shootings. And a lot of times the units that are going after the fugitives, they're doing the gang work, they're doing the drug work, their chances of being involved in a deadly force encounter can a lot of times be higher. So if a department is doing basically, damage control or preemptive posturing so they don't become the next news story, they disband those units. And immediately their headache goes away because now they don't have to worry. And they go, whew, well, we don't have to worry about being on national news. But the side effect of that is that now no one is putting pressure on those gangs or those areas where a lot of the violence is occurring. So guess what? Boom, then it goes. And that's what's happened city after city. It's a very easy formula, and sadly, most cities and most people are not going to realize that until 20 years down the road, after multiple people have been killed and multiple young men go away to prison for 30 years to the rest of their lives behind some BS gang-related drama that they never should have been involved in the first place, and maybe wouldn't be involved in if every time they turned around, people were getting arrested and going away to federal prison. And then they go, you know what? I don't want this life. Instead, some of these guys are dabbling into it, and they're not seeing arrests being made, and they're not hearing the stories of, they came in and rounded up 15 dudes and took them overnight. Like they're gone, like they don't hear those stories. So they start getting involved, and the next thing you know, they're knee deep in a triple murder. And the whole time they thought this is fun and games because they haven't been catching charges and stuff. But
well, let's hope more people become aware. They can and they can follow your podcast and follow you on Instagram, and you're spreading the good word and educating people. And so I appreciate what you're doing, and thank you so much for doing this live stream. We did almost 2 hours, so amazing. Anything else you have to promote?
Just Tuesday nights on YouTube. Andrea Uplate is the channel. It's our true crime show. It's live as well, 8 p.m. Eastern. Her Instagram handle as well is Andrea Uplate. She'll post the stories, the backgrounds. And then I have the Disruptors with Brian Sanders, where I interview everybody from former gang members to musicians to undercover detectives, soldiers, authors. I would just love having guests. You were on the show.
Yeah,
we had a really good discussion about no-knock warrants and schools, and so I love talking to people. So I post those usually weekly, and it's mostly Spotify, Apple, Google, any of those platforms. I mess around a little on YouTube, but really I half-ass it, so it's not at this point right now. I haven't really done much with it, but but definitely Spotify. And then I've got a website for training. If people want to reach out and either take some courses, or if they've just got questions they want to get answered, it's the Disruptors with Brian Sanders. And it's just a website. It's got a few classes on there that I teach that is basically virtual through a private YouTube link to watch. But yeah, that's it. Like Instagram is the Disruptors or Brian Sanders Disruptors. Like, I don't know. I run 2 different accounts, but yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much again for doing this, and stay in touch, and
yes, sir.
we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Anytime.
Cool, man. Thanks. See you later. Have a good night.
All right, buddy.